So, recently I've been back on the Mortal Kombat grind. Why? Well, aside from that new movie coming out in a few months at time of writing, I also finally got around to playing Mortal Kombat 1. The new Mortal Kombat 1, if ever there was a reason to hate that name. The reason I only just got around to playing it was because I was waiting for the Ultimate Edition to go on sale, because I'm a fan of Mortal Kombat, but I'm not such a big fan that I'm willing to pay full price for the game, the DLCs, and the inevitable story expansion. And having now just played Mortal Kombat 1, I can't help but feel my patience has finally been tested with the series. Here's the thing, Mortal Kombat has never been the most well-written series, especially in more recent installments, but we accept that. Some people don't even care at all because they're here for the action, and that's fair, but I'm here for everything. Why would they even bother making story modes if they didn't expect some people to have at least some investment? But I feel like my investment keeps being tested by the simple fact that they can't commit to what they do. I'm more experienced in post-classic MK, basically everything from MK9 on. I feel like that's the same for a lot of people because it's kind of when the series became more accessible to casual fans. Before that, there were like 7 main entries and a bunch of spin-offs. It was hard to keep up. So once Midway went down the tubes, they decided they were going to take things back to the beginning, pare things down to the basics, and retell the story. That was the convergence point that let a lot of people like me jump in properly, and I feel like MK9 succeeded at this relatively well. It was a pretty straightforward in-universe reboot, where the reboot in question offered a sense of lingering intrigue. Shao Kahn defeated Blaze at Armageddon and became the ultimate power and killed everyone. So now all that Raiden could do was send a message back in time. A vague message of which was not fully understood until the very end.
He must win. Those are my last words before I die. Lest he face the judgment of the Elder Gods. He must win.
This started the game off at a point in which, while it was a retelling of the previous plot lines, it allowed them to play around with the details a bit, because going in the exact same direction would lead to the same outcome, leading to a bunch of small changes, like Kuai Liang becoming a cyborg instead of Smoke, like in the original continuity. Still, it was mostly the same, and it was almost a drinking game at times, like you know that there are certain aspects of the series' lore that are inescapable, so they had to go out of their way to establish it. So take a shot every time something happens because it had to happen, like Jax getting his arms ripped off, or Cabal getting burnt. But the game was only the same until about 2/3 of the way through the game when MK9 did something very bold and very divisive. Not only did Shao Kahn unceremoniously kill off Shang Tsung, one of the most important villains in the entire series, and then give his power to Sindel, she then steamrolled through the main cast single-handedly, killing all but like 3 of them. To me, while the execution was honestly laughable, it kind of felt like a statement to me. A statement of, while this may be the same story as the original trilogy fundamentally speaking, we are not content telling the exact same story. We are staking our claim and telling our version of the story. And fair enough, killing off a bunch of beloved characters is certainly one way to completely flip the script, and another way to do that is to ostensibly kill off the main villain permanently. In the end, Shao Kahn gets disintegrated, dying pretty much permanently in the first installment. And this was a big deal because it had pretty much become a running joke in the original series about how you can never fully kill off Shao Kahn. And this felt like a bold step forward for the series, and you know what? I feel like MKX actually felt like it capitalized on that step forward for the most part. Even though MKX had a returning villain in Shinnok, at least he was one of the villains that hadn't been done to death. He hadn't been the villain since MK4, and his appearance in Mortal Kombat Armageddon was a glorified cameo. What really sold this game as the next bold step forward for the series, what really made it come across as though they were establishing a new normal right from the beginning, was the roster. If I recall correctly, something like 2/5, maybe half the roster, were new characters. And there were some really cool characters in that roster. I thought Takeda was really cool, Cassie Cage was a perfect mashup of her parents' personalities, Aaron Black, while underutilized, was really cool. And whatever you want to say about characters like Kotal Kahn, Ferrator, and Devora, at the very least, they had cool, unique designs. Although the running joke about Kotal Kahn being a complete jobber is not lost on me. It was to the point that when I was doing a QuickTime event sequence facing off against Kano, I deliberately failed all the QuickTime events for the sake of having a biblically accurate Kotal Kahn portrayal. Plus, they make it a point to have you play as every single one of the combat kids as they're dubbed, including Cassie Cage, who ends up being the person to defeat Shinnok.
That you? Nice.
Personally, I think it's a bit ridiculous to have a mortal human who's barely old enough to be out of high school beat the berserker form of an elder god, but regardless, they wanted Cassie Cage to be a big deal, they wanted to pass the torch, and what better way to do that than have her beat the final boss. But still, the beginnings of my overarching issue with modern Mortal Kombat in this instance begin in this game, particularly with the whole Revenant thing, because basically Quan Chi resurrected several people who died in the previous game as Revenants, basically corrupted beings used to carry out his will. Well, there's a point in the game where we see Raiden counter Quan Chi's magic, which then unrevenants all the characters nearby, bringing them back to normal. So basically, the bold step forward they took by killing off these characters was now moot. They decided not to commit to their own plotline in favor of moving back towards the direction of status quo in the most half-assed way possible. And boy did they double, triple, quadruple, and septuple down on that in the next 2 games. You see, fundamentally speaking, I was actually excited for the story of MK11 going into it because it has, first of all, the first new main villain since arguably Dagon in Mortal Kombat Armageddon if you count him as the main villain, and if not, since Onaga in Deception. Plus, this game had some really cool things at the outset, such as Evil Raiden. Evil Raiden wasn't something that was unheard of. He had a bit of a villain arc in Mortal Kombat Armageddon, but that was over so quickly it might as well have not happened. So we had a new villain and a new villain-like figure, so what could go wrong? Everything, as it turns out. Not only does Evil Raiden barely last a single chapter, but the newly introduced villain, Kronika, is a Keeper of Time who then uses her powers for alleged fan service, to bring back a whole bunch of characters from the past who had previously died, including bada bing bada boom, Shao Kahn.
I am Khan of Outworld. Vacate my throne, or I'll soak these sands with your blood.
So all that guff about killing him off permanently was all for naught. Now, let me be clear about something. The story of MK11 is one of the worst stories in any game I've ever played, and it's probably the second worst time travel story I've ever experienced, but I don't want to focus on that right now. For me right now, what it all comes down to is their inability to fully commit to any serious alteration. Both Scorpion and Sonya Blade get killed off, but because of the nature of the story, they're then replaced by other versions of themselves from earlier in the timeline. And most of the main characters who aren't dead still manage to find themselves with a temporal clone to remind you of past games. So they go out of their way to have multiple versions of the same characters we've already seen, and yet most of the characters who were introduced in the previous game don't show up this time. So ultimately, whatever steps forward the previous game took, this game almost felt like it was going out of its way to undo them. There's one major change to the status quo which is stuck to this day, which is the fact that Raiden gave up his powers to make Liu Kang the new Guardian of Earth.
He made me a god. For now, at least.
But otherwise, it's all steps back, and that is only furthered by the Aftermath DLC, where Shang Tsung makes his grand comeback as one of the primary protagonists and eventually main antagonist of the story. A DLC which is built off the back of a plot hole so egregious that it deserves its own video, so stay tuned for that. So Liu Kang and Raiden are sent back to the dawn of time on account of the battle with Kronika resetting history. But they need Kronika's crown to be able to create a new history, so Shang Tsung, Fujin, and Nightwolf agree to have Liu Kang send them back in time. That is to say, forward in time in the current timeline to retrieve the crown so they can then create a new timeline properly. I think people tend to be very forgiving of this DLC, probably on account of Shang Tsung himself, who's portrayed by the returning Cary Hiroyuki Tagawa, aka the definitive version of Shang Tsung, to the point that everyone else should just stop trying.
This alliance is temporary. Have no illusions otherwise.
Oh my God, he's so goddamn
but it is the only.
But either way, this is yet another example of what I'm talking about, possibly an even more egregious example, because while MK11 was at least attempting to try some different things in a few areas, in this case, this is a story that basically spackles over top of the MK11 story in order to make the villains Shang Tsung, Shao Kahn, and Sindel. So now technically, 2 of the 3 games in the trilogy have them as main villains. So the single thing I can give Mortal Kombat 11 credit for, the fact that they introduced a new villain, was all moot, and then we get to Mortal Kombat 1, and this is where I officially lost patience. This is where my current biggest pet peeve with Mortal Kombat became undeniable, because this is quite literally the perfect setup to do something completely unprecedented, something completely different. Basically, in the canon ending of the Aftermath DLC, Liu Kang gets the crown and is able to become the Guardian of Time, forming a brand new timeline as he sees fit. At this point, Liu Kang has the power over all space-time and theoretically could have crafted whatever he wanted. And yet, it's still the same world with the same characters, the same realms, and the same tournament at the center of it all. He had the power to diminish the presence of certain characters, but couldn't simply prevent them from existing at all, or at least preventing them from existing at the same time so they couldn't collude with each other. Is this something like a universal canon event that these characters have to exist and have to exist at the exact same time? Is it a case where you can shape the universe however you want, but it'll always correct itself like a spring always bounces back? So no matter how hard Liu Kang tries to correct course, there will always be certain things you can't prevent? I mean, that was sort of the idea of Mortal Kombat 11 when they established all the millions of previous timelines where the endpoint always ended up in a similar spot before Kronika reset things. But that was also a villain who was actively attempting to create her perfect vision of the universe but kept failing. So why would Liu Kang need to create something similar? This is the part where somebody would probably say, oh, well, where's the game if they prevent all the villains from existing? And that right there is exactly why this should have never been a plotline to begin with. So what does this new timeline even amount to? Basically nothing. There are a few token differences, such as the fact that Scorpion and Sub-Zero are now brothers, Tarkatans are no longer a species of monster and instead are a disease that mutates people, a few characters have been race or gender swapped, certain characters have been diminished and put into smaller roles, such as Shao Kahn simply being General Shao and Shang Tsung being a traveling huckster, but that's all there really is to it. There's so many of the same characters and so many people in the exact same position or similar positions that all it takes is a single outside force to put us right back to where we started. Suddenly we're back to Shang Tsung being a meddling sorcerer, Quan Chi being a pale white necromancer, Shao Kahn attempting to become the Emperor of Outworld. By the time the game's over, most of those characters end up in the exact same position that they were in the previous timelines, or at least close enough, to the point where the game's actively going out of its way to re-establish certain tropes the same way MK9 did, but without the excuse that MK9 is technically the exact same story. I mean, there's an extended chunk of the story dedicated to Kenshi getting blinded, getting his iconic bandana, and getting the sword that gives him his sight back. There's a sequence that shows how Quan Chi got his pale skin, there's a scene dedicated to Kuai Liang getting the scar over his eye, there are several scenes one after another that show how Kung Lao got the idea to make a bladed hat, and guess what? If you're not sick of the alleged new era basically being indistinguishable from the previous era, they drop the act completely and have the final act of the game involve Shang Tsung from the previous timeline.
This Shang Tsung is whom I battled for the Hourglass. I thought him dead.
As I did you, Liu Kang.
Yes, because the final battle of the previous game left time so fragmented it allowed Shang Tsung to survive in another timeline. And you know what's funny? I remember before Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart came out, when I heard there was going to be two separate versions of Dr. Nefarious, I rolled my eyes because he was already an overused villain by that point, but then they were literally doubling down on him. It turned out that Emperor Nefarious was his own distinct character, and my fears were laid to rest. However, this is an example of exactly what I was afraid of in that case. Because now you have two versions of Shang Tsung basically indistinguishable from each other, and they're literally pulling characters out of a timeline that doesn't exist anymore just to antagonize you. So now they're not just content having the same characters be villains over and over, now they're doubling up, and in this case they're tripling, quadrupling, etc. like before. Because then they have the good version and evil version of every character ever come together for a giant smackdown as the final battle. Somehow, despite Mortal Kombat being the series that it is, to me this is the shark jumping moment. This is scope creep personified. Now that we've had one universe-ending threat in MK11, now I guess every game has to have one. But it was also coincidentally a universe-ending threat that allowed them to bring back tons of characters from throughout the series. Not only that, but they also brought the pyramid from Armageddon for no discernible reason. But in the end, the biggest question I have with all of this is, what's the goddamn point? What was the point of resetting the universe if nothing's changed? Because they clearly don't have any intentions on actually giving you something different, despite the fact that in this case, it's more jarring that they don't. And you know, what's the point of even getting invested if they're gonna reset the universe every 10 to 15 years and basically do the exact same thing sans any sort of developments that you may or may not have liked? Like the analogy I used a second ago, where the game's universe always seems to correct course no matter how much you try and change. It seems like the writers themselves have that idea for the series as a whole. And if you haven't really understood my point up until now, I'm gonna spell it out for you. Mortal Kombat is a series that is indecisive as f***, where the writers keep pretending they want to do cool new things and take the series in new directions that they've never been before, only to pull back and fall back on the same old tropes. You want to kill off a bunch of old characters and replace them with new characters? Psych, we're going to gradually bring them back one by one. Oh, you wanted a plotline that involves Raiden turning evil? Psych, we're gonna get rid of him in favor of a different plot, and then get rid of that plot because it doesn't star characters we're familiar with. You want a brand new hard reset to the continuity? Psych, we're back to literally the exact same thing, only this time Liu Kang is the Guardian of Earth. It just seems like, for the first 7 games, with each subsequent entry, if they didn't at least introduce new characters and new villains, they at least tried to have a unique spin on established formulas. Like how in Deadly Alliance, the main villains were the power couple of Shang Tsung and Quan Chi, but either way, for the first 7 games, with the exception of Shao Kahn being the villain of 2 and 3, every game made an effort to be different. But it seems like ever since then, every game has just been a combination of ideas from the first 7 games outside of a few select examples to the contrary, i.e. Liu Kang, Guardian of Earth. I mean, if nothing else, I appreciate the Chaos Reigns DLC because, for one thing, turning Havik into what amounts to Kang the Conqueror with all his temporal clones and making him the main villain, and then setting most of the plot in Chaos Realm, a realm we don't really see enough in this series, I'm down with that. Like, sure, Havik is a returning character, but he's never made that big of a splash, and he's never been a main villain. So at least it's something new. It's not great because they clearly didn't have enough time to tell the story they wanted to, but you want to know what I took note of in this DLC? There's a subplot where apparently General Shao was locked up after the events of the main game, but then he escaped. Now his armies that are loyal to him are waging war against the Empire.
When Shao's rebellion ended and he was imprisoned, my advisors also urged mercy to smother the seditious fire he'd lit. But it stayed, smoldering among his followers. And when Shao escaped from his cell, it reignited.
You know what? I was sitting there at the beginning wondering how they were going to wrap up the Havik plot as well as the war subplot in 5 chapters. The answer is, they don't. So you bet your ass that's probably going to play into the next game. Oh boy, I'm so looking forward to that. Yet another game about beating Shao Kahn. Maybe there's going to be a twist. I mean, Onaga's undead army was featured in Mortal Kombat 1, so maybe we can expect Onaga to usurp Shao Kahn before he has the chance to finish the job he started. If they're going to be recycling old ideas, at the very least Onaga hasn't been the main villain in over 2 decades. But I guess the question is, sure, Mortal Kombat is seemingly allergic to committing to new ideas, but do the fans actually want something new? And more to the point, do the people working on the series really want something new, or are they just trying to retell the same stories over and over with minimal differences? Because from what I can tell, every new adaptation of the series starts at the very beginning, starts at the point where the original continuity takes off. The tournament where Liu Kang specifically wins against Goro and Shang Tsung. I mean, sure, Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks was a retelling of MK2, but, you know, that's only 1 game later. Then the most recent adaptations, most notably the animated series as well as the live-action movie series, started from a version of the start of the accepted Mortal Kombat continuity. In fact, the things that they changed only served to frustrate the fans, myself included. Like having a completely original character as the star of the 2021 movie instead of a member of the vast and diverse cast that already exists. Or how in Scorpion's Revenge, they decided to have Scorpion step in to save Liu Kang, who was actually about to lose to Goro. And you know, looking at the original run of games, I couldn't tell you how people reacted to all the different changes between the beginning of the series and Armageddon, but I'm sure at the very least, the contemporary reaction from longtime fans at the time was how the series had become completely unrecognizable. And there were probably plenty of unpopular changes they made. I mean, I wasn't there, so I can't speak for fans' experiences at the time, but I'm sure Liu Kang being unceremoniously killed at the beginning of Deadly Alliance only to come back as Zombie Liu Kang was probably a very unpopular decision at the time, because he's always been the guy. And even as far as these games, there are switches to the status quo which were very unpopular, such as D'Vorah showing up and killing multiple fan-favorite characters. Most notably Melina, who gets killed off via lesbian makeout session, which incidentally is probably the only reason why they gave her lips in this game. People didn't like the idea of a brand new character with unearned importance killing off beloved characters. But me, the eponymous outsider, wonders how a character is supposed to earn importance, or how they're supposed to become a big deal if they're not allowed to make big waves like this. Point is, chicken and egg. Are they not committing to their new ideas because they don't want to, or is it because the fans don't want the series to change too much? And I don't ask that question with any sort of malice, it's a genuine question. But regardless of the answer, that further begs the question, why did they even bother deleting the original or second very similar continuity when literally that's the thing that everybody seemingly wants? So what am I asking for here? Well, obviously I'm asking for a number of things. Write better stories with fewer catastrophic holes in them. For the love of God, stop with the multi-timeline BS and take things back to a slightly more grounded level, because I'm sick of every game being a multiverse-ending threat. But more than anything, I just want them to pick a lane and commit. If you actually want to freshen up the series and try something new, just do it. Throw the baby out with the bathwater, come up with some new villains and take the audience to places they've never been before, possibly with a mix of old characters and new characters. But if you want to keep things within a relative comfort zone, if you want to have villains be a rotating lineup of the same 3 or 4 villains with a rotating lineup of pre-existing characters, fair enough. If that's what you want, if that's what the audience wants, go for it. But for the love of God, stop with this halfway bullshit. Stop pretending you're going to change things up only to have things fall into the exact same status quo that it always does. Because the stories seem half-baked and inconsistent, with plot elements thrown away unceremoniously this way. The entire series' continuity and lore benefits when you don't go halfway with these things and just commit one way or the other. And you may be asking why I'm even discussing this anyway. Who cares about the story of Mortal Kombat? Well, here's the thing. I really love the world of Mortal Kombat in theory because the world and lore is so interesting to me. I love reading about the backstory of all these characters and how the world functions. I like the idea that all this complicated mythical BS exists alongside contemporary times, and I'm just so sick of seeing a series with all the potential in the world have that potential be squandered because of subpar plotlines. And step 1 of bringing the most out of the series is to pick a lane and stick with it. That's all I've got. If you like this video and want to support the channel, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, tell me what you think in the comment section, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.